I wanted to raise a couple of points, actually. One is with respect to Colleen and Ann's presentation, and that there seems to be, in a sense, a public understanding of the horror of sterilization that, in particular, this province was become infamous for, both because of the false science as well as the idea of what was done to people. But what I found interesting is when I was talking to people who, over and over again, who have been sterilized, is they didn't really focus on the false science, for example, or even so much on the eugenic idea as the fact that they were personally denied the opportunity to parent. And in fact, they would frequently refer to that wounding of their soul, if you want, as being denied that. It's not that every person with developmental disability can parent, of course, but that's also true for people without developmental disabilities. It's that I don't think, while we take this firm stand as a society to a greater degree today, I don't think we've come to a place yet where we understand or have the capacity to see that people with developmental disabilities can parent and should be supported to do so. And in fact, the denial of their parents, in fact, is as systemic in some ways as sterilization was today. And it's true, in fact, across cultures when we've done that research. So it sort of is a way of challenging us, actually, who stand in opposition to things like eugenics, but I'm not sure I've quite reached a place of standing beside people with developmental disabilities and their desire to also potentially have a family of their own. The other is to maybe provoke or stimulate a little bit of debate around your comment, Simo, if I can use your first name. I'm Bruce, by the way. And that is the idea that information, for example, could either be neutral or provided in a way that allows people to really make a choice. One is, of course, I don't agree that that choice should be enabled in the first place, so I can state my bias up front. I think, for example, with selective abortion, at least in the Canadian context at the moment, we're pretty clear that shouldn't be allowed, and in fact is illegal on the basis of gender, because we have a position, even though we have prejudice in gender in our society, that says that would be immoral and wrong, and would in fact jeopardize those to which we're generally prejudiced, which is women. And so we don't allow selective abortions on the basis of gender. I think if we held the same view about disability, we could argue it's not a question of information, it's a question of saying what's moral and right, and it isn't right to allow for selective abortion on the basis of disability. Nor do I believe information, in fact, could ever be neutral in a context in which there's such systemic oppression and devaluation, that the information will always fail. And so you'll still get large percentages of people choosing to abort until we change the oppressive nature. The other was about maybe there's some things doctors shouldn't be allowed to do. Couldn't agree more. But in your argument, it was they shouldn't be allowed to sustain life sometimes because it maybe isn't sustainable. And there are moments like that. But if we can limit them from doing that, we can potentially, at the same time, I think, just as logically argue they should be prevented from doing other things. So I don't think we can argue they should be allowed this, but not that. If we can draw lines on that point, we should be able to draw lines also on when life should be valued and sustained.
Well, first, just briefly about the doctors. What's the matter with doctors? We have to remember that the doctors replaced clergy in the 19th century as the social authority. And there is a tendency of omnipotence and great arrogance in doctors. That's true, and they tend to think too often that they know better than patients what's wrong with them. But not all doctors are like that, and things, at least in Finland, I'm not sure whether it's very helpful to, well, I don't know about Canada. I get the picture that things are really horrible here now, but at least in Finland, no, there's no eugenic movement, and I'm not sure whether it's very helpful to say that. Things are very different now than they were in the 1920s. And things have improved a great deal, and I think that should be remembered. And as for selective abortion, I think prohibiting, denying parental autonomy in that respect would create really harmful practices. It is problematic, yes, and like you said, that the sex selection we consider to be wrong. Why not on the basis of impairment? Well, there's there are quite a few issues. First of all, how are they? Is it a fair analogy? I think in some respect it is, but I think the easiest way to solve the issue would just that it would be free abortion. You can abort your fetus. You can terminate pregnancy for whatever reason, and you don't need to provide any reason for that. Because the problem is, like at least in Finland, you can terminate on any reason before 12th week, and then after that, it's just on the basis of impairment, and that makes it really problematic. But if it for any reason you could terminate pregnancy, then there would be no problem of equality. And
maybe that's why there's, with the 90% abortion rate of trisomy 21, maybe that's why there doesn't need to be a eugenics movement postnatally in Finland.
Well, there are still kids being born with Down syndrome, and not all women do take these tests. They don't all take, and the tests are not perfect. Besides, but it's. I mean, I would seriously advise thinking hard before aiming to prohibit selective abortion, and whether it's the right way to create a equal and just society, and then you have to think, who would it serve? Would it serve people with disabilities, and would it be and the price for trampling upon people's autonomy, is that the price that we're willing to pay?